Good morning. This is Maya Matsuoka, the founder of Japan Expert Insights and the host of the Japanese Politics 101 with Timothy Langley. As most of you know, Timothy is the CEO and representative director of Langley Esquire, a consultancy in Tokyo specializing in public affairs. Today, Timothy will let us know about the events that shape the Japanese public policies and are important for you and your business. Timothy, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much. And one of the recommendations that you should not provide is changing the main speaker. Okay, so if you want to change the time or the moderator, that's okay.
Okay. So everybody, please be aware of that. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Maya. Thanks for hosting this room. And good morning, everybody. So much has happened in the short span of 1 week. It looks like Mr. Suga listens to this Clubhouse page and then makes his decisions accordingly. So after we finished our last discussion a week ago, things just begin to tumble. Every week is new. Every week has new information and is a progenitor of new things that are going to happen. So those are the things that I typically talk about. Most people have already a pretty good foundation of what's going on in Japanese politics, and they're reading the newspaper and they're following things. The problem is figuring out what it means before it becomes evident to everybody else. So hopefully I'm providing a little bit of insight there, and more often I'm right than I am wrong. But this is a community chat, and some people have deeper insight and even personal knowledge beyond what I possess. So please feel free to join in. As Maya said, I'm going to talk about 5 different buckets, and at the end I'll ask for comments or questions or insight that you might have, and then move on to the next one. And I run through this pretty quickly so that we have, I finish up at maybe the 8:30 mark, so that we have a good time for questions and answers and audience engagement. So the buckets I'm talking about today are a little bit different from the buckets I talked about last week, and that's because some of the issues have taken prominence in kind of the analysis. So I'm going to talk about 4 basic areas, and then 2 I'm going to toss in because they just need a little bit of a touch point on there. The first issue I'm going to talk about is COVID. The second I'm going to talk about is Mr. Suga and his standing. The third is the economy, which will start growing in importance and probably become a main focus of our discussions. The fourth is geopolitical. And so after those 4 topics, I still want to touch on local administration. We touched on that last week. I didn't feel like I really gave it a very good exposition, so I want to touch on it just a little bit more this time. It actually could consume a whole hour, but just want to touch on that. And then finally, the revision of the Constitution. I'd like to end up with that. So with that, let's talk about COVID. As everyone knows who lives in Japan and probably elsewhere, the state of emergency was extended last week. We expected and anticipated that. The first state of emergency was just too short. It doesn't give us time to analyze what the numbers and what the trajectory is. So the Prime Minister extended it for the 10 prefectures, and it's going to go until the 20th of next month. Next month starts in 2 days, so in 22 days. Reading the leaves, you can pretty much anticipate that it will be extended again. Let's hope it isn't, but when you're following what's going on and you listen to what Ms. Koike is saying and what she refrains from saying, and the meetings that are had between her and the Prime Minister, and what the IOC president and his second in command are saying about, the Olympics shall go on, come hell or high water. It's beginning to get into just a real fist fight. So the resistance of people on the economy is beginning to grow and show itself. So because it's a state of emergency, the government has said, please close your shops at 8 o'clock. Don't serve alcohol. Make sure there's social distancing and that sort of thing. And for many people who live in Tokyo, I'm not familiar with what's going on in Osaka, but I think it's probably even worse in Osaka. People are just beginning to ignore that. They need to make money. They need to close the gap. They need to, pay the people that they've employed. And the hardest hit, of course, are, the hospitality, hotels, restaurants, bars, nightclubs, that sort of thing. So this resistance is being tempered by, you might remember that the Japanese government passed a bill to allow them to impose fines on people who don't toe the line. That was a pretty big deal. It didn't receive a whole lot of attention, but it's one of those things that the Japanese really don't do very well. If you don't follow what we say from the offices on high, then we're going to investigate you. We're going to send people over. We're going to fine you. We haven't seen a whole lot of that, but depending on where the numbers go, it could get worse. Also, the quarantine protocols that the Japanese government imposes on people who are coming into Japan have been tightened pretty drastically. There's a new strain that's coming out of India, as you might know. It's called B1617. It's a strain, but it's already gone on to 53 other countries. Many people who are traveling to Japan coming from those countries. So if you're an Indian traveling to Japan, there's higher scrutiny now, and they've just tightened up across the board. There is some special relaxation for athletes, for the coaches, for people traveling with the athletes, but that could change too. If you're coming here for the Olympics and you're training, you don't want to be in isolation. You want to come and get off the airplane, get acclimated, do some training, get ready, and then into the games. If the numbers turn south, and if this strain begins to come into Japan more forcefully, the government's in a very difficult place, and the likelihood of them closing the Olympics is very high. You're reading the newspaper, you're watching, you're anticipating these things like everybody else, but the forces against holding the games are beginning to grow. So it's funny that in Japan, in social context and also business and political context, it's somewhat strange. It's kind of a social democracy here, but the way things are run, any one person essentially holds a veto power of a decision at a small level, at a large level. If you are displeased and you voice your opinion, you stamp your feet, generally it stops the process. People talk about it. They try and modify and get a general consensus. It slows things down. The funny thing here is that although it's been reported that 70-80% of the Japanese population do not want the Olympics to go forward, the Prime Minister and the IOC is adamant on moving it forward. I think that that chicken is going to come home to roost pretty shortly, within the next 2 or 3 weeks. There's a lot going on that kind of tells us that. So, for example, if you look at the torch relays, so the torch relays moved up the country just like the cherry blossoms move up the country. They are scheduled to be in Hokkaido, and the governor of Hokkaido said that we're not going to do the torch relay on Japanese public roads. And, Sapporo is the site of the marathon, one of the most popular events, and actually the original Olympic event, and many of the competitive walking competitions. So Sapporo is pretty big, and to take the torch relay and saying we're not going to do it because we're scared of COVID, it's pretty telling. Even more telling, the United States on Monday announced a travel advisory to all American citizens throughout the world: stay out of Japan. There are 4 stages. There's caution at stage 1, and then there's stage 4, which is avoid that country for whatever reason, terrorists or whatever reasons. That stage 4 was announced by the United States. So that's pretty heavy. I mean, if you're the Japanese government, they have played it down. You don't see much of it in the Japanese press, but it is, for a friend like the United States to do that at this particular time, it's weighty. It does mean something. So you have to pay attention to that sort of thing. With that, I think I'd just like to close up the COVID report. The vaccines are slowly rolling out. There's a lot of tension between the government and the municipalities. I'm going to talk about that at the end. It's kind of a coin toss right now about the Olympics, no Olympics. But if you follow it closely, you'll come to your own conclusions. And I think by the time that we talk this time next week, it will be much clearer. And my guess is that they're going to cancel them and use a variety of reasons that underpin that. And the Japanese population will clap their hands, and the economy will go into the toilet, and the Japanese will buckle up. That's my assessment. Any questions or comments that we can talk about before we move on to my next topic, which is Mr. Suga's standing?
Okay, let's move on, and then probably we'll have questions later then.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Great. You guys are a great audience. Thank you very much. And not that I don't want the questions, but it keeps me on schedule. So, Mr. Suga, wow, who wants to be in his shoes now? So his good friend, Mr. Abe, came up. I think it was maybe Friday. The magazine interview that he was in came out on Friday, and he was quizzed, the former prime minister. And typically in Japan, your power actually increases after you become prime minister. You become something of a kingmaker. While you're prime minister, you can't be a faction leader. But after you are prime minister, generally you go back and you're the party leader in the faction leader in the LDP. And in many instances, that faction assumes your name. That hasn't happened with Mr. Abe. It is still called the Hosoda faction in some parlance, sometimes Seiwakai. But you remember, for the last 2 or 3 weeks, we were talking about Mr. Abe, a potential comeback, and he's starting to pour cold water on that, which is indicative of his intention to be a kingmaker, not to be the guy that's in the hot seat. And that's probably the better strategy. Rather than take the bullets, you push somebody out there who is in your faction, and they become prime minister, and then your faction just increases in power and in breadth and in membership. So he was asked, it's interesting, he was asked a question, so Mr. Prime Minister, or actually they still call him Prime Minister, it's like ambassador or bishop. I mean, once you're bishop or ambassador, you're bishop and ambassador for life, or president of the United States. So they asked him, these are the people that we like. Our investigation has shown that, the Japanese population likes Kono Taro, and they like Shigeru Ishiba and Shinjiro Koizumi. These are the candidates I think a lot of our readers would like to see as prime minister. What do you think about that, Mr. Prime Minister? And his response was pretty interesting. He went to the people who are closest to him, who have been selected by him for this or that, and it's like he owes them anyway. But he chose top of the list Toshimitsu Motegi, who is a foreign minister right now. He's already had a couple of cabinet positions. He's qualified, except for not having a LDP post, but he's very well liked and a very effective foreign minister. But he was top of the list. And then he says, I like Kato Katsunobu, who is the chief cabinet secretary. He replaced Mr. Suga. I like him a lot, and he's a very effective leader without being showy. And though he might lack some charisma, he's a very good administrator. And then Shimomura Hakubun. Shimomura is not very well known. He was formerly Minister of Education, very, very close friends with Mr. Abe. And he is, within the LDP, one of the policy bigwigs. He's probably number 3 in the LDP. So that's an administrative role. It's not a cabinet position. And he has also stated his inclination, can we say, should he be tapped as a prime ministerial candidate, he would accept that. Thank you very much. And then finally, he mentioned Fumio Kishida, who was former foreign minister, who's fallen out a little bit. It's unlikely that he would do very well in a prime ministerial race. But those are the 4 people that he mentioned. And he also said, I'm not really intending on running for prime minister. So this is very interesting in light of Mr. Suga's low standing in public opinion polls. He's less than 34 now. The last time they took the poll, he was at 34%, which was a huge drop. They do this polling every 2 months, and he fell, from maybe 46 to 34%. So that was a huge dip, and it's likely to be deeper this next time, which is bad news for him. We've got the Tokyo metropolitan election coming up, which is important to the prime minister because there are a lot of LDP candidates in the Tokyo metropolitan government as well. And his I don't know. I think I call it lack of leadership, but it sounds too bold to say that. But things just haven't gone his way, which inflects a lot on Kono Taro, who wasn't one of the prime minister's picks. So things are beginning to line up. It doesn't look very good for the prime minister to continue on, although Mr. Abe did say, we should give him more time. He's only been in the office for 1 year. It does take time. And he was a great chief cabinet secretary. I'm sure he'll do well once he gets his sea legs. So it's kind of giving with one hand and taking away with another hand. Today is the 30th. June starts in 2 days. June 16th is the last day of the diet session. And the House closes down, and almost immediately the election campaign for the Tokyo metropolitan government starts. So put that in your calendar, even though we don't have a right to vote. Foreigners don't, but maybe some of the Japanese are eager to cast their vote in the Tokyo elections. But the sound trucks will be blaring throughout Tokyo. You will notice it. They're not billboards. They're kind of boards that are going in the neighborhood with everybody's photo plastered on there. That will start appearing within the next 2 weeks. Actually 3 weeks. And things will start getting really exciting. In light of that, the COVID numbers, the extension of the state emergency, the Olympic issue, and really importantly, what's going on with the Japanese economy, and are people being punished by local governments for keeping their stores open, and it's their fault for COVID and the variants to be exploding. There's a lot just to keep your eye on and to see what's going on. But Mr. Suga, it doesn't look good. They've decided the dates, by the way, of when the election will be for the prime minister. And it is the last possible time to hold that. So they will have an extended diet session, which will end in September. Then they roll into the selection of candidates. There will be a internal election within the LDP. And then at the end of September, the new prime minister or the former prime minister will be identified. So that's published in. It could change, but that has been published. It's like steering a big ship. It does take time and a lot of administrative logistics to get something like this moving smoothly. So they've just published that just this last week. With that, I'd like to close up with Mr. Suga, see if there are any questions, comments, concerns.
I have a question to you because you
Sure.
just gave us the timeline of the elections, the Tokyo metropolitan elections, and then the general elections and so on. But how? Well, there are speculations, that well, you mentioned just a few minutes ago that the Olympics might be cancelled. So maybe the decision will be made in the next 1 or 2 weeks. So how will that decision, if the Olympics are cancelled, how will that cancellation reflect, on Mr. Suga?
That's a great question.
So
That's a great question. So you remember the Masahiro Son, the chairman of SoftBank, and Mikitani, the chairman of Rakuten. There was one other, Beat Takeshi also went on and said, this is stupid. You should cancel the Olympics. The Japanese population doesn't want it. We're going to all die. We're all going to get infected. They all went on the record to say that. I think in Mikitani's case, he might have political ambitions for saying that, for going out and getting that kind of notoriety that a claim like that makes. So the great thing for a politician is to capture an issue and to be able to speak authoritatively and in a kind of a leadership capacity about that. So new issues that come up during an election campaign, those candidates are looking for an issue. So it is not unlikely for there to be a coalition of people that says, it's like, no more nuclear power plants, what was the term? Datsun no Genshiroku. These candidates hang their hat on that, and that becomes their rallying call, and they get elected as a consequence of their stance because it reflects what the voting public kind of feels too. So you'll see that positioning. Right now, nobody likes to be a naysayer, even in politics, unless there's an issue, unless there's blood in the water, unless you're not a candidate, you're a candidate, but you don't hold the position. So it's the people who don't hold a position who are at a disadvantage. The people who hold a seat, they have generally a bigger advantage. So for being a candidate to a position and challenging somebody who is an incumbent, you really have to come up with some magic. You have to put on more lipstick. You have to be more flamboyant. You have to have somebody who is powerful speak with you with their arms around your shoulder on the campaign trail, that sort of thing. So you'll see a lot of jockeying going on here. So just to encapsulate too many words that I use to describe that, you will see a dividing line of we need to do the Olympics. We don't need
Timothy. Oh, okay. I think we lost him. I hope he will be back. So, and I think Ted, I got your raised hand, and I'm trying to get you on stage. Sorry if I. Okay, Timothy, are you okay? Are you there? Okay, we've got probably connection. Sorry.
Okay, somebody didn't like my comment.
Maybe not. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming back anyway. So, yes.
I didn't have anything else to do.
Right.
So I don't know when I got cut off, Maya, but I finished that soliloquy and I passed it back to you. I don't know if that carried over.
Okay, we've got Ted. Ted, thank you very much for coming on stage. Please.
Thank you.
Good evening, Ted.
Good evening. Hi. Thank you, as always, for your wonderful analysis. I just really find it helpful. A question for you. Are not the Olympics an opportunity for Suga to improve his political prospects? If the Olympics are pulled off without a problem, I suppose they don't have to be the best Olympics ever in world history, but if they go off without a problem, would that not help his political prospects? Maybe even Japan would be delivering a piece of good news during an otherwise dreary time for the world amidst this pandemic. Otherwise, it just seems to me the next event going on in that part of the world is the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. Not exactly, a beacon of hope for the rest of mankind. Isn't this an opportunity for Japan and Mr. Suga? That's all I wanted to ask.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ted. And thank you for your service, all your work that you do for the community, too. So, yes, it would be great. If you remember the Olympics and all of the excitement that was about Japan is going to host the Olympics, that was during Mr. Abe's administration. And the great theme there was Japan suffered from a triple disaster, the earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear fallout, the nuclear disaster. And we want to show the world that we've come back. It's a comeback spirit. And it's just like in 1964, we pulled ourselves out of the defeat of World War II and a largely agrarian society. And now we have washing machines and televisions in every house, and we've got Shinkansen, Tokyo Tower. They wanted to replicate that. And that has fallen by the wayside. I mean, people aren't even really talking about it unless somebody like me reminds people and they go, oh, yeah, I do remember that. And the challenges that we have now is just getting through it. And I think even if they hold the Olympics, the funny thing I'm going to talk about a little bit, actually after Suga, I'm talking about the economy, is that even if they pull it off, the punch in the face that the economy is going to take either way is going to be pretty bad. And the administration will be blamed for that. So in any event, I mean, the prime minister is always looking for something that, a tailwind, something that's going to carry him a little bit forward, make him look, good and possess leadership qualities. And he's the guy that we want to take our country forward. You're not seeing any of that, even if you're looking really closely. And he's struggling to find something like that too. So it doesn't look very positive, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. So if there's nothing else, I'd like to move on to the economy, because like I said, with Ted's kind of suggestion about isn't there some scenario where the prime minister will be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat? And none of the forces are cooperating with them. So if you remember the first 3 months of the year, January, February, March, the economy took a 5.1% decline. That's after suffering from COVID for a year. So it's funny how the economy works, even though shops are closing down and people aren't buying and food prices are rising. The stock market is doing it incredibly well. 1 year later, we've got January, February, March, the first quarter, the economy finally takes a bit of a hit. And given that things started more than a year ago, it's starting to catch up with us. The likelihood of it happening in the next 3 quarters, April, May, June, is highly likely. So April, May, June, the numbers come out sometime in July, what the economy was doing in the second quarter. And if there are 2 quarters of a decline, then that is the definition of a recession. So Japan in a recession, closing the Olympics, not going forward, still struggling with COVID vaccination, that sort of thing. It's very sobering for somebody. The employment rate for April, adjusted annually, is 2.8%. So that means there was a fall in employment, 2.8%. And if you're just following trends and trajectories, you can anticipate that number is going to increase. It's probably going to be far bigger when they announce what happened in May. Food prices are going up, but they said that the consumer price index is down only 0.2%, which is kind of interesting, but it's not fully telling. Food prices are not included in that. The biggest contributor to propping it up is communications fees, which is basically cell phone fees. You'll remember that when Mr. Suga took over, formerly being the minister of the telecommunications ministry, he imposed, maybe is not quite the right word, but he convinced the telephone carriers to reduce prices, so everybody fell in love with him. And even though they reduced prices a little bit, it did have a big impact. Even though the fees themselves fell about 29% over the average, it did have a pretty big effect on consumer prices overall. There's only so many wells you can go to dig that up. Given that he was the minister, given that he's now prime minister, he can go to that well pretty easily. There aren't very many that he can go to personally. Maybe he can impose upon some of his cabinet officials. But, while he's doing that, while he's imposing on people to do more and to work harder and to get things going so that he looks good, people are looking around and thinking, but my other friend, I think he's going to be a candidate. And if I continue to be close to Mr. Suga, it means I'm not close to my other friend who I think is going to be prime minister. So this confusion, this indecision, it always damages leadership. You can't be aggressive. You can't have full vigor when you're in somebody's position like the prime minister. So you will see a lot more vacillation. We've already noticed that when you see him on TV, pronouncements and COVID rollout, that sort of thing. He's really between a rock and a hard place. And when the numbers come out for May, I think it'll be that'll be 2/3 of the quarter. And even the analysts, the people who are looking at the stock prices and trying to figure out what's going to happen under a scenario where the Olympics don't go through, and what happens under a scenario that they do go through, but they go through with no spectators, or they go through with spectators. Right now, no spectators. That's the public position. It could go on with limited spectators, depending. But none of the signals are really looking good. And the analysts themselves, these guys really carry a lot of weight, because they tell policymakers, what direction the economy is going based on decisions that you're making today. They're being more and more conscientious about the Olympics. The Olympics is falling into their purview very heavily. And I just think it's not looking so good for the Olympics to be held. If you put my feet to the fire and said, don't vacillate, tell us what you think, that would be my assessment. So with that, I'd like to close up the economy and move on to my last main topic, which is geopolitics. A lot going on there, but any questions or comments on the economy?
While we are waiting for questions, I have a question to you, if you don't mind me asking. So do you think that one of the reasons for the indecision of the government with the Olympics, I mean, to be clear on whether to hold the Olympics or not, is that if the Olympics, because there is a lot of pressure on the government in terms of what you were talking about, the economic outlook and well, basically uh, the downturn of the economic. Like we know that, of course, the public opinion is against the Olympics, but at the same time, probably the government has all those figures, and they understand that even if the Olympics are cancelled, and then let's say the impact of that cancellation, the single impact is not that big, so probably it will trigger other trends which will drag the economy even further downwards.
Yes. So that's the analysis that's going on right now. I'm sure it's been going on for a long time, but it's starting to reach the public eye and being talked about in newspaper and magazine articles. So they've done an analysis of what's the worst that can happen. We don't do the Olympics. What is the economic hit there? Or we do a kind of watered down Olympics. What does that look like? So there are a lot of smart people that are thinking about this and crunching the numbers and coming up with different recommendations. But the worst thing that can happen is that they hold the Olympics and there is a cluster, something happens, the strain continues, and then all of these athletes and the coaches and the people who were in Tokyo go back to their home countries, right? And now this infection, this spread, it's just like what happened at Wuhan when they had Chinese New Year right at the time when everybody was eating, bat sandwiches. So that is actually the worst that could happen, and it could exacerbate a bad situation here and paint Japan in just a really, really bad situation. So that evaluation is, since the likelihood is not zero, the likelihood is it's actually probably an unacceptable likelihood. We won't know right now. The new strains that are coming out, they have hit Japan, and they're fighting hard to keep it out. They're putting more restrictions on people who are coming into Japan. Staying in the hotel, having their iPhone checked, and that sort of thing. So, yeah, the economic impact, I think, might even be the deciding factor when they come up with that, based on what the infection rates do over the next 2 weeks. They have to make a decision. I think they've already made a decision, but I think they just have to take a little bit more time so that people are more accepting of what the decision ultimately is.
Thank you. Nathan?
Yeah, my question was similar to your question as far as it was along the lines of the sunken costs, the over budgeting, the construction projects that went over budget, and how are we going to recoup? How is Japan or Tokyo going to recoup those losses? And it sounds like the answer is they're not. Is that correct, Tim?
That's right. They're not.
That's what I was worried about. Thank you.
Yeah. So a lot of the people who are losers here. So just think about Appa hotels, right? Appa hotels. There were no Appa hotels before the Olympics were really much of an issue, and now they're everywhere. So she built these hotels in anticipation of the Olympics and tourism and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of money poured into that. Appa is actually one of the supporters of being a qualified government hotel where you should stay to spend your 2 weeks. So they're accommodating the government. They have special hotels that are set up that are dedicated to serving people food and taking care of people who are coming in from overseas. But there are thousands of other people that have made other investments, and plus they're just crooks. The big companies that have purchased all of the advertisement, who have locked on to some of the juiciest parts of running a big event like that. They don't want to lose their money. Their shareholders don't want to lose their money. They swooped in early and were part of the discussion, and they feel like they deserve, and in some sense they do deserve, a certain portion of the windfall. If there's not, I mean, there was never any calculation that the Olympics wouldn't go through. The only calculation was, how successful will it be? So Dentsu voted very heavily on the Olympics, put a lot of money into it. There have been some analysts who say, if the Olympics are canceled, that's it for Dentsu. Dentsu really put the money down on, their stake of the Olympics, the television rights, the advertisement, the sports athletes, selling product, the drinks and the furniture and that sort of thing. So, there are a lot of people that are going to hurt from that, but I think they've already calculated that, this stadium that we built, if you remember what a fiasco that was, it was the bid was granted, the design was accepted, and it was some foreigner, so we can't have that. So they came up with some cockamamie idea that it shouldn't be that. So let's have the Japanese architect. It's just like highway robbery, but it's all recognized, and there are good reasons for it. But there's a lot of that stuff that's going on, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Prime Minister has his hands tied so much. He is beholden to many of the people who are supporters and people who vote for him, and LDP members. LDP is the party of big business. So sorry for my dour assessment, but I think it's pretty close to accurate, Nathan. Thanks for asking the question.
Thank you.
So with that, I'd like to move on to my final big bucket, which is geopolitical. And the biggest thing about geopolitics with regard to Japan, it's not so much has to do with Australia or even North Korea. North Korea has been quiet. You'll have noticed. Seems like South Korea, North Korea, Japan, the United States, they are in it's not a stalemate. It's just a groping time. Where do we actually stand with regard to each other? What's Biden's policy on North Korea? Will he meet the great leader? Mr. Trump did. What is the stand? So it's being kind of working its way through. The boogie bear that we have to watch is China, and there is a lot going on there. There's a lot going on with regard to the United States' position on China. Kurt Campbell, who is a pretty well-known administrator in several successive administrations, is point person at the UN Security Council on China, and he said we need to completely revamp the way that we're thinking about China. We need a new era of engagement. This is, if you're Chinese, these are scary words. This is like you're arming up. What's going on in Hong Kong, we've talked about this before, it is a precursor to what's going to happen in Taiwan. And what happens in Taiwan is a precursor to what happens to Japan and to the Taiwan Straits and to the shipping and to all of that stuff. So these things are incredibly important to watch, even though at a glance it doesn't look so huge. It's a progression that is beginning to take a worrying momentum. So, for example, Apple Daily is a newspaper, pro-democracy newspaper in Hong Kong. Their billionaire owner was arrested, and he's behind bars. They've had some goons come in and smash the printing press a couple of weeks ago. A lot of intimidation going on there. And then the Chinese government, actually it's the Hong Kong government, voted to allow for a different kind of voting. So the voting initially, you might remember who was it? Al Gore. Al Gore and the hanging chads and Hillary Clinton and the last election with Trump and the voting and mail-in voting. So the mail-in voting is a way that people say it's very easy to cheat with mail-in voting. How do you verify who sent it in and that sort of thing? So one of the new laws that was just pushed through the Hong Kong administration was allowing for voting rights for mail, and also a diminution of a certain class of voters holding about 50% of how votes are calculated to 25%. So this encroachment is going on. It will happen first, as just almost always happens. It'll happen first in Hong Kong. Hong Kong will be established as a more the Chinese role will be much more dominant. People will flee there. They'll flee. The money people will flee there. They can get out and they'll purchase. They used to be doing it in Canada. A lot of Chinese in Canada, more likely Taiwan because it's close, but increasingly to Japan as well. The next issue would be Taiwan, and there's lots of movement going on there. The U.S. stance with regard to Taiwan has been really ambiguous, because even if you say something about Taiwan, the Chinese just take real umbrage at that. So, for example, maybe 2 days ago, a big movie star, John Sessa, was in Taiwan promoting one of his new movies. So he was in Fast and Furious. He's a muscle guy. He was I think maybe a professional wrestler. He got into movies. So he's one of the Fast and Furious stars. He was in Taiwan promoting his film, and he talked about Taiwan being a country, just kind of a slip of the tongue. And boy, did he get lambasted. He had to go on TV and apologize, and I didn't mean to say that. And of course, China is the wonderful country, and I didn't mean to outspeak. So you've got that going, right? Taiwan doesn't have an embassy of the United States there. It has an administrative body, an administrative trade and economic division. The person who sits there is not of ambassadorial rank. It's interesting. You remember that we talked about Ron Emanuel being named as Joe Biden's candidate for ambassador to Japan. His number 2 is the fellow who is ambassadorial rank in Taiwan. He will be number 2 in the Tokyo embassy, and his transition occurs very shortly. Similarly, there is no embassy of Taiwan in Tokyo. It is an economic trade and industry administrative body. And there was when these diplomats get together, it's noteworthy. And for the first time in a long time, the ambassador, he's not ambassador, the charge d'affaires in the Tokyo embassy, Joe Young, had dinner with the ambassador, although he's not ambassador, he's an administrator from Taiwan, positioned in Tokyo, had dinner and talking in friendly terms about the relationship. So the reason why it's ambiguous is because you just don't want to generate animosity with the Chinese unnecessarily. So ambiguity extends as far as what would happen if China attacked Taiwan. What is the United States obligation? What's the Japanese obligation should that occur? And that's been pretty much ambiguous, but it's becoming more and more clear, with Kurt Campbell saying we need a new era of engagement with Chinese. Their encroachment, their moves on the Spratlys, on the artificial islands, on what they're doing with Taiwan, the encroachments, the overflights and the violation of airspace. It's just increasing. And as was said before, their navy grows exponentially every year. It grows as much as France's entire navy on a yearly basis. So any incursion with Taiwan is going to be predominantly naval, and probably mostly with submarines. And so there's a lot of trepidation there. There's a lot of watching, and so the Quad, United States, Australia, India, and Japan, that initiative is beginning to take a lot more energy, and also what's going on between Taiwan, Japan, and the United States is beginning to take more prominence. And finally, with regard to geopolitical, you will notice that the Japanese government has requested a far more expansive budget for defense. So the problem with the defense budget in Japan is that Japan doesn't have a defense industry. It builds and cooperates with largely the United States, but with other countries too, to build military armaments, but the Constitution doesn't allow them to have offensive capability and doesn't allow them to produce for sale offensive armaments. They can produce defensive armaments. So if they want to have more of a high defense capability or even offensive, number one, the Constitution doesn't allow that. And number two, they don't have the production capability. So if they are going to increase their budget for defense, that means their reliance on the United States will have to increase, because that's where the sophistication and the advanced technologies are. So it's a real difficult mix. It involves a lot of different different moving parts. Sorry, I'm just getting distracted. Okay. With that, I'd like to close up the geopolitics. By the way, you might remember that there were two diplomats from Myanmar who, once the coup happened, they went to the other side. They didn't follow the government line and promote the coup. They were fired, and they're now living on the economy here in Japan. The Japanese government has, although their passports have been withdrawn by their issuing country, and their visa extension, the extension of the time that they can stay in Japan legally is coming to expiration. The Japanese government has boldly said, you can continue to stay here. Not quite refugee status, but you can be sure that if they go back to Myanmar, they're going to suffer for that. So it's an indication of what the Japanese are considering doing, what they're evaluating with the junta there, and what they will do. Nothing has been really decided, although a lot of the Japanese companies are cutting production. It's still left to be seen, but that's another kind of finger in the eye with regard to Myanmar and China, Myanmar and Japan. So it's all a very complicated mix. I hope it's somewhat easy to understand. But anyway, with that, I'd like to close up geopolitics and ask if there are any questions, comments. We've had another couple people that have come to the forefront.
Mayuko, thank you very much for coming. Please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. Good morning. I have two questions. The first one is, I guess one theory which I learned in this room earlier was that perhaps Prime Minister Suga was just going to be almost like an acting or interim prime minister, and that this whole thing was sort of a setup for the next real prime minister to come up. And you were talking about his lack of leadership. And that you talked about what Abe said in the magazine interview, and he mentioned Motegi and Kato and Shimomura and Kishida. I guess my question is that how much of sort of Japanese politics is rain behind the curtain? Like, what when you talked about his lack of leadership, wasn't this something that they would have known anyway beforehand? So that's my first question. And my second question is that I actually came across Nikkei Asia's article last night, and the title was GPS subs and microelectronics, and it said Biden defense budget is all China, which is sort of in line with what you just said about how we should all watch out for China. So, what do you think is the impact of this new defense budget on Japan's defense strategy, and how do you think this would affect the public opinion in Japan in terms of constitutional amendment? And could you perhaps talk about the latest with the constitutional amendment proposal? I think there will be national referendum, am I right? I'm not really sure what's going on right now, so if you could update us on that, that would be great.
Thank you very much. Like you have woven together your comments, it's all interrelated. You know, the United States under Trump criticized, the swamp, the element of U.S. politics that is actually running politics. It's been claimed by presidents ever since Dwight Eisenhower that there is a force behind what the public perceives as what's going on in American politics. And there's probably a lot to that thesis. In Japan, I don't know how deep you want to go with this. I think probably Hayato has a lot of insight and his own opinion on it. But it's kind of been like that ever since the end of the war in the United States, helping form the Constitution and establishing the LDP, and that hasn't stopped. But I think your question is more about who are the power forces behind the prime minister. And the prime minister does wield a lot of power, but he's not a president. He's a parliamentarian prime minister. So he does have to respond to certain things that a more forceful kind of administrative government might project through a leader. If Mr. Suga is supported by those powers, he can probably do pretty well. He'll stumble, he'll make some mistakes. He might look a little bit feeble, but the machinery continues to go on. The LDP, what's going on in the LDP that's 2 blocks away from the upper house office building of the members. They kind of knew about Mr. Suga, but he was a great administrator, but then again he had Mr. Abe. And Mr. Abe said in this interview, Mr. Suga's doing fine, but he doesn't have a Mr. Suga, which is a little bit of a slap at Katsunobu Kato as his chief cabinet secretary. But, Suga was pretty darn good at what he was doing. Doesn't mean that you're going to be good as prime minister. And I think that evaluation will be made very quickly. And I think most people come to the same conclusion. So now you have this race. Is it going to be Konotaro? Is it going to be Motegi? Who's pushing who? And if you've got Mr. Abe pushing, who's going to be pushing Konotaro? That's going to be Aso, who is the deputy prime minister and the foreign minister. So that would be a kind of a cool fight to watch. But getting to your question so who's pulling the strings? Well, obviously, who are the kingmakers? If Konotaro becomes prime minister, it'll be Mr. Taro Aso, who will reap the benefits from that. And if it's Motegi, then Mr. Abe, his power just increases and a legacy continues. With regard to revising the Constitution, the first step of even touching that is the referendum law. And the Committee on Reforming the Constitution has been a committee ever since Mr. Abe has been prime minister. It has met maybe 3 times. Finally, it met 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and the opposition party said, okay, because we've received some concessions that you and I really are not familiar with, we will concede that the referendum law will be passed. It went into the Diet, and it will be passed this month. So the first key, after many years of it generating so much consternation, will be moving forward. You take a look at that. You take a look at the request for the increase in the military budget. And there's a bill that was also put into the coming out of committee. It will come out of committee in a week or so. It is, once again, voting. Allow for the hanging chads, allow for voting for Japanese people. We want to rush this one through so that we can use this law for the Tokyo metropolitan government, because, we're all about, helping the people vote, right? So they're not encroachments, but there's these modifications that go on that help not just what people are talking about, but also help the referendum. Once the referendum is passed, I think everybody knows. Let me just explain. So 2/3 of the upper house need to pass a revision to pass the Constitution. 2/3 of the lower house need to vote on it, and then it goes to a referendum, and the Japanese population gets to vote on that, and that just requires 51%. And then the revision to the Constitution. Once again, as everybody knows, the Japanese Constitution has not been touched at all since its creation in at the end of the World War II under the administration of MacArthur. So I don't know, maybe it's not a very satisfying response, but that's my assessment of that, Mayako.
Thank you. I guess how likely do you think is it that Abe actually comes back as prime minister?
I actually like the prospect, because I think it energizes the Japanese population, and there are some benefits to that. But I kind of put it low right now. It was high 2 weeks ago. Last week it was relatively high. This week with the magazine article that came out, yeah, maybe 15%.
I see. Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thanks for joining us. Tomoko.
Yes, I got 2 questions, which I think you didn't touch. Is one, LGBTQ regulation? No, thing, because the LDP decided to postpone the decision, so that
they don't like it.
How serious actually they are. And the second question is is vaccine to Taiwan. Of course, Japanese government have to think about the waiver issue, but how quickly Japanese government can make a decision, either dispatching to Taiwan or dispatching to COVAX. That's my 2 questions.
Okay, so with LGBT, yes, it went into the committee meeting. I think it was on Friday. Today's Sunday. I think it was Friday. It might have been Thursday. And it just turns out that the LDP, they talk a big talk, but I don't think their heart is behind it. And so a couple of the more powerful figures came in and said, what the hell are you guys talking about? This is not what we want. I'm not fully supportive, but I think that is the kind of tone of the conversation. So yeah, it didn't move forward. It was expected to move forward. But if you take a look at women in Japanese government or in leadership or in Japanese politics, under Mr. Abe, he had the campaign of, women shine, let's hire more people, let's put them in positions of influence and give them responsibility. That hasn't really taken off. They've just published the numbers of females who were hired as public servants. So that starts in April 1st, right? As everybody knows, they matriculate, they get out of school, they go through their job interviews, and then the fiscal calendar starts on April 1st. And that's when all the new bureaucrats started. 34% were women. Just a slice above what they projected. I think they projected 32 or 33%, and it's 34. So see what we're doing. See, aren't we addressing that? You can see the marketing beauty of that. We said we'd do it 32, but we did 34. So aren't we great? I don't think their heart is behind that one either. And the population decline. Fewer and fewer women. 2021 is going to have the fewest number of births, on record, and it will surpass what happened last year, which was also another record-breaking year for the Japanese population. So something's got to give, and if nothing gives, then the Japanese population will decline. And correlated to that is obviously the Japanese economy. It's number 3 in the world. Numbers don't support that with the declining population. If the population continues, and there have been several reports and analysis that kind of substantiate that. So is Japan comfortable with being number 16 economically from after being number 3? Automobiles, the production of automobiles, it begins to slip because of the availability of the chips and condensers and the supply chain. So it's all, I really appreciate everybody signing into this room, because it all comes together. The pieces all match, but they have to be put into some sort of a context so that we can understand what's going on. I hope that responds somewhat. Tomoko, I'm sorry if it is kind of discombobulated.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I understand. How about Taiwan AstraZeneca's vaccine?
Great. Okay. So it seems like you're following that issue. So Taiwan, we did a piece a couple of months ago entitled Vaccine Diplomacy. So various countries are going to the producers, and I represent Japan, and I want 36 million doses, and I come from Brazil, and I want 40 million doses. That kind of negotiation at the government to company level, and the companies are forced to play diplomacy, and so their governments are very much involved in that. Some of the vaccines are coming out of the United States, some of them are coming out of Germany. And Taiwan, this is interesting, I don't know if many people know this. So Taiwan had been in negotiations with AstraZeneca and purchased or been on contract to purchase several million vials. And you might remember that Taiwan was remarkable in that COVID just didn't seem to hit them. They had such low numbers, and then all of a sudden the doors of hell opened and they got hit really hard. So they're waiting for that vaccine to come in, and China stepped in and said, hey, wait a minute, China, you want to sell your product to China too, don't you? I mean, we have our own vaccines, but AstraZeneca, you don't want to piss us off like that movie star did, right? Dealing with Taiwan. So this is coming in really hard at a very bad time, and China is flexing its muscles. It's doing that in such a scary way that people take note and try to accommodate so that they're not blacklisted. So there's a lot going on there. With Taiwan, I think they are in a bit of a tight spot. I don't know how it's going to come out, but we'll talk about it next week because there'll be more information on it. How's that, Tomoko?
No, my question is how quickly, because already we received AstraZeneca vaccine the other day in Tokyo, in Kobe. So I'm just wondering, because right now Japanese government already announced that they will consider about sending over to Taiwan the vaccine. So I'm wondering how quickly Japanese government will decide whether they will going to send over to Taiwan or not.
Okay, I understand better now what your question was. So the funny thing is that Japan has had stockpiles of the vaccines for 2 months, maybe 3 months, and just hasn't rolled it out. That's one of the areas of frustration. But allocating some of that to Taiwan, wow, that's a big deal. That's a real hand across the water and shake your hand and slap you on the back. Maybe that's what Chargé d'Affaires Joe Young and the ambassadorial rank individual who represents Taiwan in Japan had to talk about at their dinner earlier this week. It's somewhat rare for them to meet and for it to be talked about publicly, but there is a lot going on in the background. I was not aware actually that Japan had offered to supplement the vaccines for Taiwan, but in light of the Chinese threat, maybe the Quad and the participants of the Quad are coming in and say, we're here for you. Not only, for defense capabilities, but you're hurting because of COVID, and the Chinese are beginning to exercise and put you in a disadvantaged state. We're here for you. That's pretty significant.
Okay, thank you. Tomoko-san, does it answer your question?
Okay, never mind.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to go cry now.
Okay, so let's see. Hayato, how about you? What's your comment today?
Hi. One kind of in the context of the geopolitical, discussion with the U.S. and China or Japan would involve Japan. There's one kind of interesting kind of update, which was the Amazon, in the U.S. bought the MGM studio. And then also at the same time, the China's Wonder Group sold all the stock that they own at the AMC, which is the largest movie theater chain in the United States. And those things, so whenever to me, this is very significant because for the United States, those are like a top icon. Now that they just kind of threw out the Chinese, and I am like a co-founder and kind of co-owner under the globally number one ranked entertainment advisory business in Los Angeles. And our biggest clients are U.S. federal government, right? And also the Chinese government was client, right? Yeah. So to us, but this is like it looks like whatever that's going on in politics is now going to even the media and entertainment, right? Yeah. So when I update something like this to those who are close to Chinese, they will say, it's just coincidence. But in the world of geopolitics, there's no such a thing as a coincidence. Right. So for that, I think my impression is the U.S. kind of getting harder with the Chinese. That's a kind of stock observation, and not related to maybe Japan at this time, but it will be. But because as you know, when China and the U.S. get harder, and Japan is going to be in the front line. Right. That's one. Another one, kind of my common observation is that U.S. would never let the Chinese take the upper hand in military power. So that meaning, that's my personal opinion, but everybody that I know say the same thing. So for that, if other Chinese will become more active and build the military power, U.S. is going to engage. It's just a matter of time. And also, my understanding is that Japanese self-defense force, the naval self-defense, is far built than, say, the U.S. Navy when they did the exercise. Because each time when they do the battle exercise, always the Japanese, the naval force kind of win the U.S. naval. Right? Yeah. So for that, if the U.S. gets engaged, the Japanese naval force will be on the front line to protect the United States. So for that, like this, a lot of things may be coming, maybe a lot more things are going than it looks like. At the same time, as suddenly, Abe kind of popped up with a discussion for the amendment of ninth constitution, right? So those things, all the timing seems to be. Oh, I'm sorry. So like it seems to be that all this everything on the timing seems to be just like very closely interconnected. And as you know, Japan, or defense force, they have been very slow in getting this kind of military preparation. They just have a budget to build defense capability, but those. But like we may have those, the amendment is coming and was coming a lot closer than it looks, in my opinion. And also that as Mr. Abe, he has been doing a fundraise for him to come back, for this second month now, right? So for that, regardless of what he says in the press, my opinion is he is still eyeing for the third term. And but also but it depends on how the situation is going to look like, because he's going to resign to give heat to this Suga, right? So he doesn't want to go back and take the heat again, right? Yeah. So for that, I think it's everything's kind of correlated. There are a lot more big moves that's coming for upcoming. That's my kind of comment, right? And then also that Kurt Campbell, is when he comes, okay, he's going to try to do some bad things, in my opinion, right? So he's not there for nothing. He's there to do something, So for that, I think we may be heading for some big, chaos in the near future. That's my observation. And also, in addition, recently, the Taiwanese officer tweeted by mistake the U.S. force has been in Taiwan for the battle training, right? So they're not supposed to be there, right? Yeah, so there are a lot of things going on behind the scenes. So we're gonna see what happens. Thank you. I'm done talking.
Thank you. You don't have you haven't said much that I disagree with, and I always appreciate your insight. It adds flavor and texture to other things, and I'm not always sitting on the Oracle of Delphi, knowing everything there is to know. So I appreciate your input too. And so I'll just leave it at that. Invite other people to come up. Takeshi-san.
Hi, Timothy. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I can hear your daughter in the background too.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, about COVID, starting this week, U.S. mainstream media suddenly started reporting about the COVID has been developed by the Chinese institution in Wuhan. Then Dr. Fauci has been funding that for many years, which is, and this is something that Donald Trump has been talking about it, but U.S. mainstream media ignored it. But I start seeing those media coverage starting this week. So what is your take on that?
Oh man, that is such a great comment. So anything that Trump says, of course, is wrong, and anything he tries to do is bad. While he was president, if you're the party that's out, and they were just so mad that election was stolen. Hillary Clinton was supposed to be president, and he played it. So the vengeance and the animosity directed towards the Republicans in general, and Mr. Trump in particular. I mean, everybody in the world knows that. And it wasn't helpful when the president, spoke, aggressively and indelicately with world leaders and some of the things that he said. But yes, if he said that, the virus came out of Wuhan and it's the Chinese virus, of course they're going to say, you're so crazy. And Facebook, if you post that, it was created in the lab, you get censored. So big media is involved in this kind of this narrative too. But now that Mr. Biden is president of the United States, they're acknowledging that, yes, the likelihood that, so before it is impossible. This comes out of bat sandwiches. This is because people in the wet market in Wuhan were eating bats, and this is how it happened. And the evidence is almost unmistakable now that it is not. It is artificially created. The fact that it was spread maliciously with a design is still open to question, but the fact that it was created purposefully is becoming less of a question. And so the Democrats, unless they want to continue to look like idiots, have to analyze and come up with the facts and acknowledge those. And so I think politically they made one set of decisions and explanations just because it was different from what the sitting president said. But now that that's changed, I think the facts of the matter, and this is very important because if it comes out that in fact it was created in the laboratory, and as you pointed out, Dr. Fauci was involved economically in that factory, and as was the United States. There's plenty of blame to be cast around, and it's not just the Chinese. The United States had a hand in that as well. It's all very much underwater, under murky water. Maybe we won't ever know, but it's convenient and it's attractive to blame the Chinese, and it also fits the other narrative about their encroachment and trying to diminish their adversaries politically and economically. If it was, it sure seemed to work pretty well. But I don't have anything further to add on that. But it is a great comment, and people should be watching the development of that narrative.
So COVID is, as a matter of fact, is a bioweapon type of thing.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Takeshi. Thanks for calling while you're outside and engaged in something else too. Always appreciate you participating.
My wife is always bitching about that, but
welcome to the club.
Well, thank you. And we've got Fumi as well. Fumi, please go ahead. Yes.
Hi, Timothy. Hi, Maya. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah. Okay. So I don't have any questions, but I want to leave comments because it's been recorded, so it's going to be short. So I'm the kind of the person who is supporting the Olympic happening in Tokyo in this year, and I'm very minority. I'm 20% of Japanese, population who is supporting Olympics. There's a sort of silent pressure in this community in Japan. If I sort of say, I'm supporting Olympics, they kind of go, what? Are you like taking money instead of like lives? Just wanted to say, and people who are against the Olympics believe that the people from overseas coming for Olympics, like athletes, coaches, and press people, they believe they have the mutants of the coronavirus, and they will spread the whole thing in Japan and etc. That's what they are worrying. But however, they are likely to be vaccinated, or at least they've done like a PCR test already. So they are pretty clear, and they are kind of in the bubble. So they are not going to go out to do a lot of social things. We as Japanese people, they are kind of walking down the street. I went to Osaka yesterday in the sort of the city center. A lot of restaurants open, serving alcohol. They are already ignoring the state of emergency because we are sick of this, fed up with this, the more than 100 days of a state of emergency in this year. We have to realize this. We are actually spreading this COVID, and regardless that Olympic is happening or not, just it'll go up or go down, whatever we control. So canceling the Olympics will kill our economy because our economy is already dying, like almost like an insect breathe like an insect, like almost dying. And if we cancel this Olympic, it's a last stab to our economy. So I think Japanese people have to realize how important this event is, because it's been a lighthouse of Japanese economy for a whole time since this has been decided. So that's what my opinion. No questions. Thank you very much. I'm done speaking.
Thank you very much, Fumi. And you are actually running a farm, aren't you?
No, I'm not. I'm a real estate. I'm just renting my properties out to tenants and stuff. So I've been suffered because a lot of restaurants who I'm renting to, they just ask me to reduce the sort of the rent fees or the council the rent fees, etc. So I've been suffered. So it's pretty difficult. I'm raising roosters for hobby, but this is my pit. So yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So there's the only thing I can add, just as a foreign observer, is that the Japanese are globally acknowledged to be just very highly risk averse. They don't want to consider risk, and if risk is on the menu, they take a lot of time to evaluate it, and probably as in COVID, they're still evaluating it when the threat comes and goes, and now you're beyond the threat, and they finally make a decision, even though they've had 20,000 meetings about it. So yeah, I would like to see the Olympics go forward and be successful and be a shining light for Japan and what Japan is these days. But I think all things taken into consideration, it just doesn't look to me to be very promising. But next week we'll talk about it again and reevaluate, and maybe you're right and maybe I'm wrong, but we're going to know within the next 2 weeks, I predict. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've got Tier. Sorry if I mispronounce your name.
It's okay. So thank you so much, Maya. Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you.
So I would like to come back with the organization of the Olympic Games. I think the risk is still here, because I'm talking from the perspective of someone who was kind of involved inside. I was volunteer. I just withdrew my participation as a volunteer just because we were told that as volunteer we will not receive vaccine. And as you can see, there will be around 30,000, I think, volunteer, included this field cast and the city volunteer. So if those people will not receive the vaccine and will be helping the athlete, that might be really complicated. So that was one thing that I was really concerned about. And now I would like to ask to Timothy, how likely do you think the Olympic might be canceled? So that was my question. So I'm done speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Tier. You're a first-time caller and first-time listener, I guess, right?
I've been listening for a while. I think this is the first time I'm listening. I'm just quite down.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I think my period of vacillation is coming to a close. I'm negative on the Olympics being held as projected. I think there's just going to be some event where all of a sudden it's a tipping point, and Koike and Suga, they just have to throw down the gauntlet. The economy will suffer, but the potential repercussions of not doing that will be evaluated as far greater, and it's just they're going to lose one way or the other. They've already lost, so it's just it's like a disaster mitigation. What can we do to ensure that what we lose is the least amount? I think that's the analysis that's going on now. So I hope that addresses your question, but please stay tuned and please continue to. I mean, you're involved. A lot of the volunteers have resigned. not just because of the issue that you have, that they're not getting vaccinated, but also because the former chairman said, in the committee deliberations, we don't want to have so many women because they just talk too much. But seeing as you're a male, that probably doesn't impact you. But the fact that you're not getting a vaccine, and I'm contributing, I'm volunteering, and what the hell is that? That's pretty big. So it could be that, the volunteers they begin to bolt in mass. And how are you going to run the Olympics like that? Ross, you're joining us. You've got the birds in the background.
Hey, Timothy, how are you doing? I'll
Good.
mute myself after this. I'm outside. Been listening for a while. Yeah, good to hear this show, by the way. Hey, just a quick one on the Olympics. I haven't heard much talk about postponing for another year. It seems to be kind of vaguely raised and then just taken off the cards. And it seems to me that there is obviously a lot of pressure on the Beijing 2022, and people are wondering what to do about that. I mean, wouldn't it kill two birds with one stone if they just delayed it a little bit longer and then threw it in at 2022
I thought so,
Has there been
too.
any talk about that?
Yeah, I thought so, too. We talked about this last week, so you get demerits for not listening last week and taking notes. I thought that, it would have been kind of a nice, the Winter Olympics and then the Summer Olympics, revived Japan. Wouldn't that be kind of nice? It might take a little bit of cooperation with the Chinese Olympic Committee and the Japanese Olympic Committee to collaborate and to cooperate. So maybe that's one of the sticking points. But also there's this we're going to boycott the Chinese Olympics. I mean, these guys are just so outrageous. We're not even going to send a team. That was done in the past with great impact. It might be done again, but I think the best strategy for the United States and probably for China too is nothing really aggressive. You can still meet your objectives on Taiwan without shooting bullets and dropping bombs. For example, a blockade or a slow boil, where the United States were they to interpret it as a very aggressive move, and this is what we're going to do. In light of that actually generates more risk. So, there is no talk of holding the Olympics, although it does hold some merit with all of the infrastructure that the Japanese have. But the athletes themselves, I mean, they're just under exhaustion. They're going to wait for yet another year. It just doesn't make sense.
Thank you. Russ, I hope this answers your question. Okay. So, Tomomi, sorry. Please let us know about your thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Here, I'm not the expert or anything. I'm just an educator working at the college. Oh, first of all, I wanted to say, Timothy and Maya, I love the way of you talk. Always soothing, very, kind, and sometimes funny. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome. And here, I work for a college at Osaka. And since I might have more chance to talk to younger generation, Japanese, and also exchange student, because I teach Japanese to them. And the Olympic things surely changed Japanese younger generation's mind. I worked for college for 6 years, and this Olympic things probably the first time Japanese students talked about politics, about Olympics, and those LGBT stuff as well. So Olympics is really, easy topics and really relatable for younger generation. So this really, kind of lead them to be more interested in politics in the future. Like before you talked about voting rate stuff and revision of constitution stuff. So the younger generation now kind of, interested in more the politics, government, and protest stuff. So maybe in the future, this movement lead to younger generation vote more and make some big change in the future. That's my thought. Thank you. I'm done speaking.
Thank you very much. If I can just throw in a comment or two there. you remember this magazine article that Mr. Abe was quoted in, and they mentioned Konotara, they mentioned Shinjiro Koizumi. And they also mentioned Ichiba, who is just even not a contender. But they mentioned these two younger people. And I think the magazine editors and the writers are very close to their readership, maybe a little bit more than the LDP is. And the LDP and the Japanese population, the voter rates of the last three elections that we had, we talked about that about 3 or 4 Sundays ago. The voter participation is very low, and getting the younger people to be interested or concerned or just watching and discussing it at some sort of a organized level is kind of scary, because it means that the entrenched old oligarchy remains in place, and then the people who have power, they continue to have power, and the transitional change that we might be seeing with Mr. Suga is only a dance of shadows, because somebody in the background who is older and wears a loud suit and doesn't want to talk about LGBT and is not in tune with what's going on, they're still pulling the strings. So it's really essential for a well-functioning democracy to have everybody's voices represented. But even just saying that, the demographic inverted pyramid of Japan, tells you you've got 36 million people who are 65 years and older, and the people who are in the population gap that you're talking to is relatively small, and it's going to continue to be small. So although the weight of supporting all of these older people as they retire, as they need more medical care, as social services, that responsibility falls on fewer and fewer shoulders. So I suspect that they will become more and more active as this reality begins to hit them. So we're on the cusp of a great, to me, a great reawakening. Maybe the Olympics is a splash of cold water, and we go through a reassessment as a consequence of that, whether the Olympics are held or not. But I think Japan is in a very delicate period, and it's delicate because I think we're transitioning from one kind of environment to a new kind of environment, and you can see that through the establishment of the digital agency, with the establishment of the Ministry for Caring, for the Ministry for Taking Care of Kids. There's a lot going on. It's not under the table going on. It's actually going on right in front of us. It's just there's a lot going on, and so sometimes we miss the implications of these very significant things that are happening. So hopefully this room brings those out and helps people to calculate a little bit more accurately what the trend is and where the Japanese government is going, where the economy is going. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And then Gary, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Gary.
Good morning, and thank you, Maya and Timothy, again for this room. And I have been watching some of Timothy's YouTube videos. If you're unaware of it, definitely go to Timothy Langley, Esquire. It's well worth the time to watch.
Are you laughing at all the right places, Gary?
Well, I'm just bobbing and weaving,
Thank you very much. Thanks for the plug.
Two things. One, some consider Bob Costas as the greatest sports reporter announcer ever in the United States. He's covered the Olympics since 1988. And in a recent interview, he mentioned that prior to the 1990s, the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics were held in the same year. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for this to happen, and therefore there is a realistic possibility that Japan could postpone to 2022. That's number one. Number two, second thing I'd like you to comment on is China and North Korea immediately criticized Japan for any type of military, what they consider expansion. For example, the commissioning of the Izumo destroyer, which is actually an aircraft carrier, and its sister ship, the Kaga. Yet China and North Korea have a massive military. They have nuclear capabilities. They've been using intimidation tactics for the last 2 decades, complete with missile flyovers and artificial islands, and in China's case, extending the military as far as and including Africa. I'd like to think the change in the U.S. approach to Japan and to China is going to be a positive thing, in that the TPP is being revived, and Ron Emanuel has been nominated as the ambassador, which signals a tougher, firmer hand in dealing with this part of the world. But I'd like you to comment on how it seems that China and North Korea, in spite of themselves, are pushing Japan to be more militaristic with all of these threats looming over Japan. And perhaps with the United States backing, Japan will step forward and take a more, what I'd say, normal approach to national defense. So any comments, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't know. I think although Japan and certain factions, certain individuals within the LDP, and even younger politicians want to see a strong Japan. They want to see Japan as a beautiful country that can project its influence and not be beholden to the United States to defend itself. I mean, how embarrassing is that, right? I mean, if you're a patriot, you don't want to have that, and you don't want to live your life and have your economy guided by somebody who imposed on you. I'm saying that pejoratively. Who imposed on you your constitution? So the people who are having these thoughts now in the study groups that are going on have not been touched by what happened during the Pacific War. They're the grandchildren of people, or maybe even the great-grandchildren of those individuals, and they're so far removed from it. Although, yeah, there are people who talk a big talk about supporting the United States, and there are certain alliances and certain conventions that the United States and Japan has signed where if the United States becomes embroiled in a conflict, Japan has a responsibility for support and supply. They will become the first targets. The supply chain will become the first targets in the event of a controversy. And I mean, the Japanese population is not prepared. Is not. I mean, can you imagine losing Japanese soldiers overseas in any kind of conflict? The Japanese population will just go berserk. And one of the great things about Japan, one of the unique aspects of Japan, it's not unique in the world, but it is unique. It's certainly unique in this region, is their peace constitution, and for good reason. I think a lot of Japanese take great pride in that, and there's great security in that. As a neutral country, there are certain countries in Europe that have greatly benefited from that. And so I think that is the model for those kinds of individuals. But you can understand the tectonic battle for people who say, look, this is our country. We want to be able to defend it. We want to be able to write our own laws and not be beholden to people. And converse to that is, the people that say, look, we suffered enough. We damaged our relationships with all of our neighbors for generations. We apologize, but we apparently haven't apologized enough. We still have people who are, enemies of us, even though 2 or 3 generations have have gone on. We have we should take pride in a peaceful constitution without, the ability to project military dominance among our neighbors. But just my final comment there, and I don't mean to be dour about it, but there will be a conflict in the world within a relatively short period of time. And the highest likelihood of that conflict is probably Israel, Iran, somewhere like that. And the second one is Taiwan. Taiwan is a huge flashpoint. And if that happens, there'll be progenitors that you'll see. You'll see Taiwan, you'll see Hong Kong, Myanmar, North Korea. You'll see things, and so it's important just to keep on top of those. But I predict that there will be an unfortunate clash, and lines will be drawn, and the United States will have to make some important calls. I think Hayato's observation was really good. That in comparison, the Japanese Navy, I find this hard to envision, but the Japanese Navy is the pride of the Japanese defense forces. It's been the pride of the Japanese military for decades, ever since the Japan-Russian War. But that they are in war games judged to be superlative to the United States with everything that the United States has, I find that to be difficult to swallow. But even with a superlative naval force, it's just not a large enough percentage of the Japanese GDP to actually project offensive capabilities, which is a different game than defensive capabilities, obviously. And with the economy the way it is now, GDP debt ratio, the highest among OECD, 256% is dominated by debt. There's just, certain realities that the Japanese need to accommodate, and I think it's probably comfortable to sit under the United States umbrella for another couple of decades while they still, look for the next new technology that they're going to dominate, the next new Walkman or the next new Toyota. I think that's not impossible for them to do with rare earth metals and the kind of the re-centralization of software and super chips being manufactured here in Japan. There's a lot to be said, but I think the main thing I take away from this is Taiwan is such a big issue, and no matter what the Japanese do, the Constitution, the revision of the Constitution, or the dedication of more than 1% of GDP to defense capabilities, I just don't see it making that much of a difference. Thank you for the question, though.
Thank you, Timothy. With this, we are going to complete the conversation. We will be here again next week at 8 o'clock. Thank you very much. Please join us, and before that, have a wonderful day.